Well, the Inspector General's report is out on January 6th, and it confirms what we knew all along. The FBI had dozens of informants in the crowd that day. It also confirms the FBI lied to the American people about what happened that day. Also, Democrats in Congress lying to the American people on what happened that day. Not surprising at all. Our next guest was targeted and arrested by Biden's FBI because he had the audacity to be a journalist on that day, an independent journalist on January 6th. That day, he was there with his camera, microphone, capturing what was happening as the day unfolded, hundreds of hours of footage as a result of it. But of course, that didn't comport with the official narrative of an insurrection on that day. Steve Baker is now an investigative journalist with The Blaze, and boy, does he have a story to tell. And I wanted to have Steve on to really talk about the Inspector General's report, but also give our audience a little bit of history here on what it was like to be a journalist there on that day. A day that really changed everything for him. Steve, welcome to the show. Nice to see you for the first time here on Redacted.
Hey, Clayton. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with that day. Just maybe you can kind of contextualize what happened for you on January 6th as an independent journalist going to the Capitol on that day.
Very simply, I had no clue what the day would unfold to be. I went there to cover the event at the Ellipse. I had my man on the street microphone, the camera. I was going to interview some people, see what they thought. Actually, at that time, we were still wondering if they were going to, quote unquote, release the Kraken. You remember that about
Right.
the election, controversial election. And so that's what I was there to see if that happened. Actually, of course, obviously, nothing like that took place on the stage from any of the speakers or President Trump himself. So myself and another writer, we started working our way over to the Capitol early because there were planned events there. There were actually licensed, permitted events at the Capitol that day, 6 of them permitted by the Capitol Police. And so knowing that these other events were taking place, I headed that direction. And I got there probably about roughly 25 minutes after the violence had already started. So I wasn't, even there when it first took place. And first thing I did is I turned on my camera and went into, photojournalist mode, which I'm not. That's not what I do for a living. But the point being is that's what I ended up doing for the next couple of hours. And I followed the story where the story went. I captured the violence that was happening on the Lower West Terrace there. And then when the line broke through up top, and there was eventually a breach of the building itself, which I did not see. I was not there for that. But I lined up in a line of hundreds of people that were going in, including, Clayton, 80 to 100 other journalists, by the way, that we have identified who entered from the outside to the inside. These were not the journalists that were assigned covering the event, the certification on the inside. So there was between 80 and 100 other journalists that actually went in from the outside. And there was only about 4 or 5 of us that were charged. Now, as you can imagine, the 4 or 5 of us that were charged with crimes were ones that reported to the right side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, shocking, right?
Right.
I think it's unbelievable the number of journalists that were there that day that, of course, if they were with the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever else, they didn't have to live in sort of terror for a number of years. You then received a letter, an email, from the Department of Justice, basically letting you know that you were about to be charged, and then for 2 years you had to live under this umbrella of waiting, right, to find out if you were going to be charged. I actually first learned about your story. You were on my friend Tucker Carlson's show before he left Fox News. That's how I first learned of your story, and I think that charge you had just learned about was sort of imminent at that time, wasn't it?
It was. I had been threatened with prosecution by the Department of Justice in November of 21. So this was a week before Thanksgiving of 2021. And then we went into a media blitz to kind of like a counteroffensive. And as a result of that, we didn't hear from them again for 20 months. So in August of last year, August of 23, I got a grand jury subpoena for my videos that I had taken that day. So now we knew that they had either reopened the investigation or they were looking deeper into my situation. And then it was another 5-6 months before we got another notification from the FBI that, in fact, I was going to be charged. We went into another media offensive. This time we held them back for another 3 months. And then finally, at the end of February, they contacted my attorney and said he's got to turn himself in next week. And so we voluntarily voluntarily, cooperatively complied. And I was self-presented to the FBI field office here in Dallas, Texas. And that's where they put me in chains and took me before a magistrate at the federal courthouse for misdemeanor.
What do they charge you with?
By the way, leg chains for nonviolent misdemeanor crimes.
Misdemeanors in the United States. I've never heard of someone being arrested in that capacity for a misdemeanor and hauled before cameras like that. Have you?
No, as a matter of fact, two of my attorneys are former federal prosecutors, both of them with over 20 years in government service, both of them assistant U.S. attorneys at the time. And in their entire careers, they had never, ever seen that one time. And in the 100-plus year history of the FBI, they never so much as investigated a misdemeanor case until January 6th.
Well, it's good to know they're really doing the work of the American people right now, protecting us from people like you.
Exactly.
I mean, it's unbelievable. So thank you for that context there. Hope our audience understands, what has happened to our country, the weaponization of the Department of Justice. And, we had Christopher Wray and other members of the FBI testifying before Congress multiple times. And now we know lying to the American people, lying to Congress about informants, agents in the crowd that day. Were they there to incite the crowd, get them to come into the Capitol? We know Nancy Pelosi on camera talking about this trap that she talked about publicly. We now know from video footage of that, along with Chuck Schumer. So your response to this Inspector General's report, which shows and confirms that there were informants in the crowd that day, using that term instead of FBI agents. What did you make of that when you saw this report?
Well, first of all, when you analyze the report, and you've done as much research into this for the last 4 years as I have, you realize that there was a lot left out. And then when you talk about who the actual CHSs were, the confidential human sources, as opposed to FBI agents, as opposed to undercover agents, there's a lot of misinformation. In fact, there's a lot of misinformation on both sides, our side, their side, that are misinterpreting this report. Let's start from the beginning, because it can be worse and it can be not as bad depending upon how you look at it. The first thing is we know that we had this number of a couple dozen of CHSs. Now, these are confidential human sources. These are not employees of the FBI. These are basically contractors that are assigned to follow somebody, maybe even participate with them in the development of a crime to a certain place, but they're not supposed to break laws while they're doing that. We know that a number of them did, in fact, go inside the restricted space. We know that a number of them did go inside the building that day. And yet none of them were charged with crimes. And that actually has an interesting component to it, because they have a higher standard in that they know that they're not supposed to, participate and break any laws as a CHS. Now, again, they're not FBI agents. The one thing that this report does not cover, or let me back up. One thing that a lot of people are inappropriately commenting on and conflating this is they're calling these people undercover agents. No, they're not. An FBI undercover agent is a very specific assignment, a very specific protocol. It is a very specific duty, and you are trained to be an undercover agent. Now, there were probably, Clayton, I would estimate there were probably a couple of hundred FBI agents in that crowd that day. We're talking, well, the Hoover Building's just a few blocks down the road. The FBI Washington field office is there. And so because you are plain clothes, which most FBI special agents are anyway, it's not like the Hoover days when they all wore, black suit and tie and a white shirt. These guys dress casually. They wear jeans, they wear docks, they wear button downs, they wear flannel shirts. And so these guys were in their offices that day, probably, I would assume, threw their winter, coats on and gloves and put a cap on and headed down to the crowd. And Clayton, that's not necessarily a nefarious thing. We would want our law enforcement agents to be in a position to observe and to a position to make sure that nothing bad happens in a crowd like that of that size, because that crowd ended up being much larger than anybody originally anticipated to begin with. And so having that many people observing and just doing the work of making sure that everybody's safe is not a bad thing. All right. Now, if any of them donned MAGA gear, if any of those agents wore a MAGA cap or put on a Trump scarf or were carrying a Trump flag or something like that, now we enter the world of undercover FBI agent. That's a completely different designation. We have no proof that that happened yet. We know beyond any shadow of a doubt that FBI agents there. We have identified them fake. We have other journalists, other investigative reporters who have actually done the work and have identified them, and we know that they were there. We don't know the number of them, and we probably never will. We certainly don't know the number of them from this IG report, but they do talk about the fact that they have no evidence of undercover agents working that crowd.
The report does go on to say that these were members of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. So they admit to that piece of it.
Well, look, I think there were probably more CHSs, confidential human sources, embedded in the Proud Boys than even this number reflects. There were certainly, we know because I covered the trials of the Oath Keepers, and we know that they had confidential human sources embedded in the Oath Keepers as well. I'm not so sure that the Oath Keepers had any there with them that day. It's likely they did, but they certainly were not on the same level as the Proud Boys. You know, the Proud Boys famously, they like to knock heads. They were there to, they wanted to. What the Proud Boys wanted to do is they wanted to engage with Antifa and the like. They wanted to engage with leftist provocateurs, and that didn't really happen. So they took out their adrenaline and their testosterone in other ways, which they shouldn't have. But the Oath Keepers, by contrast, did not engage in violence that day at all. And they were a much smaller number in terms of the actual number of Oath Keepers that showed up. And the Oath Keepers is a much larger group. Oath Keepers had 35 to 40,000 members, paid membership. And they only had, by FBI estimates, about 25 to 30 Oath Keepers there that day.
A couple of the things that really stood out to me in this report, the report says that those sources, those confidential human sources, had warned them of possible violence on January 6th. And yet that means that if they knew about this ahead of time, they didn't have the ample law enforcement there to stop it or to make sure that they could handle it.
You and I could spend 3 hours just on that question right there. And that's because that's where I've spent most of my work for the last 3.5 to 4 years, has been answering that question. And a lot of that has to do with why the intelligence was not passed down from senior leadership at the Capitol Police to their frontline officers. Their frontline officers had no idea what was coming that day. We know that from trial testimonies. We know that from whistleblowers. We know that from numerous sources within the Capitol Police, that they were not fed the intel that they had. Also, this IG report is soft sells what they actually knew was coming that day. We know from past reports and past testimonies from so many others, including the January 6th committee, they knew what was coming. They knew that, in fact, there was and were reports that it was going to be infinitely worse than it was. They were expecting, quote unquote, MAGA to show up heavily armed with firearms, and that those firearms were going to be used against police, and that hopefully by the people that they were alleging to commit, that would be committing these crimes, were going to actually attack Congress members that day. And with all of this intel in their hands and available and passed up to Capitol Police leadership, this never was disseminated to the lower levels. But we know that the FBI knew about it because, Clayton, the FBI pre-deployed the tactical units and SWAT teams of every three-letter federal agency were either in the Capitol, at the Capitol, or just outside the perimeter of the Capitol and ready to come in. And they were there. Within 5 minutes after Ashley Babbitt was shot, I was in the building when that happened. I saw ATF tactical teams all over the inside of the Capitol. They were already there. The FBI SWAT team, tactical teams, their hostage rescue team actually was, their HRT was in the building. It was the FBI HRT medics that were working on Ashley Babbitt when I walked past her at the south exit of the building.
So one of the big questions I have is who are the leaders of this violence? I mean, if they had these confidential human sources, were they led to believe that it was going to be MAGA supporters, Trump supporters, who were really going to be the rabble-rousers on that day? Or was it they themselves that were going to be the rabble-rousers on that day? It's kind of hard to parse that out here in this report. What do you make of that part of it?
The report's not going to lead us in any, clear direction in that way. I am absolutely convinced, at the very least, that January 6th was allowed to happen. Look, even if we're talking about MAGA, even if we're talking about the right had never had an explosion in violence like we had seen from the left in 2020. The Summer of Love, the post-George Floyd riots where they were burning cities down. Then those riots continued on throughout the year. We had never seen riots coming from the right like happened on the inauguration evening of 2017 when Trump was inaugurated the first time. And they were attacking federal officers by the hundreds, and hundreds of people were arrested for violence against federal law enforcement officers. We'd never seen that kind of activity from the right before. But this was dry tinder for MAGA. They had been, this crowd, so many of these people had been put out of work because of COVID protocols, lockdowns, things of that nature. They had a contested or what they believed was a stolen election. And so it was dry tinder for it to be taken advantage of by the right kind of provocateurs. And by the way, anybody that knows anything about color revolution, anybody that knows anything about our own intelligence community, our own very elite special forces, know that we provoke and we do these kinds of things overseas for God and country all the time. I had a 3-star general in the course of my investigations, and we're going to be doing a very large story about this coming up soon. I had a 3-star general, former second in command of SOCOM, who said, I would only need about 4 or 5 of my best guys to make January 6th happen.
Wow. Yeah. Look at the Maidan coup in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Look at Syria. I mean, the list is endless for the amount of color revolutions that we foment on a regular basis. And people, it's very easy to pull off. And then it looks like those are, it's MAGA that was responsible for it, right? Because they're there next to these individuals who are stirring up the crowd. And it's very hard to say. Steve, I'll get you out of here on this. Of course, President Trump, in his Time Magazine interview, talking about pardoning these J6ers. And I would assume pardoning, of course, wiping the record clean would include yourself, right? When you learned about that, what did you think? And what do you think about the pardoning of the individuals who were there that day?
Originally I was one of those people that believed that pardon should only happen for the nonviolent misdemeanor people. There's certainly a lot of nonviolent felons as well. I mean, Stuart Rhodes got 18 years. He never even went into the Capitol. He was never committed any violence whatsoever. He got convicted and sentenced to, 18 years for this seditious conspiracy based on scary words that he had said, not because he called for violence of his oath keepers that day. And I could give countless examples of that type of felon who, because of words they said in social media prior to or after January 6th, they were convicted of felonies, not for their actions that day. And I was not convicted for my actions that day. My conviction was based on my reporting and the things that I said. My judge in my final hearing where I pled guilty, he chastised me for my journalism. He chastised me for referring to the Department of Justice as weaponized. He chastised me for referring to the bias of the court. He didn't chastise me for my actions. He chastised me for my journalism openly. And we're going to be doing a story about that. So I originally was in the, pardon all the nonviolent offenders. But now I'm fully in the John Adams court of opinion, which was, after the Boston Massacre, when he defended the British soldiers. And he said, right, I would rather 5 guilty go free than 1 innocent suffer. And I am fully in that camp because I have seen the bastardization of our justice process by the Department of Justice, by the FBI throughout this entire process. And as I said, I can give you example after example after example of the lies and of the distortions and of the lack of due process that the Department of Justice has imposed upon people. And and we have already done many stories about it, and it's not done. January 6th is not going to be over if January 20th pardons happen. We're going to start seeing the truth of what's been happening for the last 4 years. It's going to start coming out in a much greater number, particularly if the new administration, new Department of Justice, new FBI leadership, new Congress does their job.
Well, I said I'd get you out of here a second ago. Final thoughts on Kash Patel coming in at the FBI. What are you hoping you'll see from that side of it? Forget the pardon piece of it for a second, but from the new leadership in the Department of Justice.
I'm certain that he won't do what he originally had said he would do in one of his earlier statements, where he was going to turn the Hoover Building into a museum. Yeah. I wish he would. I wish he would continue. I wish he would go that route. But there needs to be a decapitation of the top leadership there, quite deep, I would imagine, probably all the way down to the special agent in charge at all the field offices, because those have become political appointments now. And then, of course, then on the lower level for the last 5 to 10 years, you've had all the DEI hires and the lowering of standards, lowering of physical fitness standards, lowering of all types of entrance standards, which were incredibly high before this new era that we live in now. And so I think that they're going to have to lop off the bottom level, and they're going to have to lop off the top level. And there's probably some really good guys still left in the middle. And it's going to be a tough job for Kash to clean this out.
My guest has been Steve Baker, investigative journalist with The Blaze. One of the reasons we know so much about this January 6th story is because of you and your incredible work on this. I encourage our audience to follow you on X. You publish a lot of reports there, and of course at The Blaze, where you can dive more deeply into this. Steve, great to have you here on the show, and hope you'll come back.
Thanks, Clayton.